of the Conservative Party's agenda, beginning at the tail end of the May government, extending all the way through the Johnson years, now into the age of Truss. And so working out how we can reconcile the pursuit of net zero by 2050, alongside the government's new pledge to try and become a net energy exporter by 2040, and well as in the much more immediate term, getting through the energy crisis we're facing this winter, how this can all be made compatible with our net zero agenda is what we're going to be talking about today, and whether so can be done at a reasonable cost. I'm very happy to be joined today by Alex Stafford, who is the Member of Parliament for Rother Valley, Dan McGrail, the CEO of Renewable UK, Giles Wilkes from the Institute for Government, and Zoe Jarrah, the Principal Policy Manager, Citizens Advice Bureau. And so the format for today's event will be a series of speeches, short speeches, I hope. So if you're getting to about 10 minutes, I'll cut you off, sorry guys. Then we'll move on to, I'll ask a couple of questions, then we'll move on to a group Q&A session. And again, I reserve the right that if people start monologuing rather than asking questions, I will cut you off because we want to get through as many questions as possible and have a proper, interesting debate. So without further ado, Alex, can I ask you to make your opening remarks?
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here with you guys today. And although you concerned me about saying you're going to be off 10 minutes, because to me the question, net zero saving money as well as the planet, is a one-word answer. Well, obviously. I mean, there's been one. If we have any panelists who will speak to 10 minutes on the subject, they're on the wrong place, because there is no discussion, frankly, on this conversation. The question is, what is the best way of saving money, or how quickly we can go this? But it's clear that by supporting net zero, we will save families money, but more importantly, it will generate jobs, wealth and opportunities for Britain, and also boost the economy, and to use the now slightly out-of-fashion term, level up the country. I'm not sure if we can still say that now, but hopefully we are.
How's it going to contribute to growth?
Indeed, that's it. But we want to level up. We don't want to. And for a seat like mine, a red wall seat, Rother Valley, we need a bit of levelling up. So we've got to first of all look at the saving money aspect of it. So clearly, net zero will result in national benefits. That will save money across the board. But we've also got, we could talk about home insulation and expensive aspects of that. But we should also look at some of the cheaper, easier things. And my favourite three-word phrase for this conference is boiler flow temperature. How many people know what the boiler flow temperature is? Well, then you're weirdos, because most people don't, in a lovely way. And did you know, I'm sure you do know, if you put your hands up, if you turn that down by 22 degrees, it will make no difference to your heating in your home, but will save about 10% of your gas costs. Why are we, as the government, not telling people that from an easy switch, if you have a combi boiler, admittedly, you could save 10% of your gas costs and save money and benefit the planet? I mean, it's stuff like that which is just so basic, so very basic, which will benefit everyone straight away. And it doesn't involve putting on more woolly jumpers. It doesn't involve sort of tearing out your heating system or putting hydrogen in the pipe. It's a very simple, cost-effective and efficient way. But so when we talk about net zero, we should be very careful, I think, about what we are talking about. Because net zero to most people outside this room, outside this conference, doesn't mean anything. But if you're talking about saving 10% of your energy costs by a simple turn of a button, that is something. And we have to be very careful when we talk about all these terminology, like net zero, carbon, EPC, that actually this doesn't appeal to many people. People don't understand it. People don't want to understand it. It confuses people. Before I got elected, I worked for WWF, so I'm a big fan of environmental issues. And the worst things people who care about the environment can do is talk about things like net zero, talk about things like carbon, talk about all these terminology. We need to talk about saving money, having a better place to live, a warmer home, a cleaner car, a faster car, frankly, more efficient car. It's these things. And that is the way that will encourage people to get involved in net zero and save the planet, as we're saying, but also save money. We've also got to look at the macro issues, and clearly with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which has sort of forced up gas prices across the world, that we can no longer afford to be part of the hydrocarbon market. Simple as that. We always knew, being ad hoc to people like the Saudis, ad hoc to people like Putin, Venezuela, all these other, Iran, all countries with a bad system. But now more than ever we've proven we cannot make the devil's deal, which we have been doing for the last few decades. We cannot support these countries, because you never know when one of these countries might blow up, literally, when it comes to a war or something. So we need to wean ourselves rapidly off our hydrocarbons, because that will then save us money, give us energy security. So we need to roll out faster and more efficient when it comes to renewable technology. We should get there first. Because we are in a climate crisis, and it is a global climate crisis. The whole world sees this, and the whole world is going low carbon, net zero. So if we as a UK get there fastest and quickest across the whole spectrum of things, we're not just talking about better EVs or lagging your boiler, but I'm talking about the financial models involved to finance this. I'm talking about training and upskilling our engineers and technicians to make this a reality. We then can have a new industrial revolution. We can then build a far better job base in this country, and then we can export in potentially hydrogen molecules. We export the technology, the expertise, and make far more money for our country. So when it's about saving money, it's also about making money. And I know I said I wouldn't talk for very long, and I already have, but one thing we're always talking about, and so much of this conference has been talking about in the energy sector, is saving money. I've heard very little about making money. Making money off your home, feeding back into the grid. We should be telling people, you can use your home, which is probably the most expensive asset you'll ever own, and the biggest asset you'll ever own, to make money by feeding into the grid. We should be encouraging people to get the benefits of actually seeing their home and renewable, not as saving money, but making money by getting green technology, photovoltaic plates, battery installation, to actually help make money for people. And that is how we should be framing the argument, rather than, frankly, doom and gloom and putting on more woolly jumpers.
Thank you, Alex. And don't worry, that wasn't too long a speech. Dan?
Basically what Alex said, although I'm going to have to scribble out the word net zero and carbon from the speech that I've written. But look, first of all, you very rightly point out that what we're living through is a gas crisis, not an energy crisis, and I think that there's been a lot of language which has been sort of misplaced over the last year regarding that, and hybrid prices are not driven by anything else fundamentally other than the price of gas. I'm representing the renewables industry, and what we have within our sector is an enormous success story, frankly, which has been built upon successive governments building a world-class policy framework in order for us to do business and in order for us to help reduce the costs of renewable energy, which were, a decade ago, very high, but now are by far the most competitive form of electricity generation of any type. A new wind farm, a brand new wind farm, built this year, will deliver electricity to consumers at about an offshore wind farm, about £37 a megawatt hour, compared to current prices for gas, about £600 a megawatt hour. So a fraction of the cost, and that's in a power station that was bought and paid for a decade ago. So we really are at the edge of, at the vanguard of saving customers money right across the country. And that policy framework has been vital. What that means today for people is that, and I had a look about an hour ago, about 45% of the electricity that we are using in this country right now is coming from wind, and the grid in total was about 62% zero carbon. Right? So we have made huge strides in getting to this point. If we did not have renewable energy on the system right now, we as a country would have needed to import, and talk about becoming a net energy exporter, we would have needed to import another £30 billion worth of LNG coming from those countries that you referred to this winter, or this year alone. So it's an incredible economic impact, and therefore the climate argument is a very important part of the equation, but this is a hard-headed economic case for us to do so. And I'd like to sort of really build on this point about energy exports. What we're calling for as a trade body is really real clarity from this government and from all governments about the targets that we want to set, be that the 50 gigawatt target for offshore wind, for a 30 gigawatt target for onshore wind, and also targets for marine energy, where we can become a real world leader, and we already are a world leader, but we can become a real exporter of that technology, and also hydrogen, which you mentioned, and green hydrogen in particular. And I want to tap into that energy exporter angle, because we as an industrialised country, and with the huge wind resources and solar resources that we have in this country, can generate big surpluses on our pathway towards net zero of electricity, which we can turn into renewable hydrogen. And given our industrial makeup, we will have a surplus of that hydrogen at the end of it. And what we know about Europe is Europe will have a deficit given the industrial profile. So we have a ready-made export opportunity for both renewable electricity and for green hydrogen by the time we get to 2040, if we do this right. To do it right, I think this government is already doing a lot of the right things. The talk about supply-side reforms and speeding up planning, making sure that big projects can get through the system quickly is important. We do need a major reform of our national grid. I mean, that is a long overdue investment which is required to reflect the fact that most of the energy that we generate in future will come from the extremities of the country, whereas previously it was generated in the centre. And then this piece on skills is really important. We already have a skills challenge in this industry, and as many industries face, but we also have an enormous opportunity. We're going to need about 1.3 million technically trained people to deliver net zero by 2050. So that is a big opportunity for our young people to get involved in this industry. So this is a pro-growth agenda, and if we deliver this low-carbon electricity, we will add to UK industrial productivity, competitiveness, and we will build the factories here in the constituencies that you're referring to, Alex, creating tens of thousands of good quality jobs in the supply chain. We already have about 31,000 people working in the offshore wind supply chain, and that can grow significantly. So my final message is keep the messaging clear and consistent from government. I think the ambition for this is really important, but we as private industries are going to deliver about 175 billion of private capital to deliver just the offshore wind ambitions alone by 2030, which is a huge economic opportunity and relies on that stable, world-class policy environment that I alluded to at the beginning.
Thank you, Dan. That was very interesting. Giles?
Thank you very much, William. Can I first start with just a little bit of personal history to explain why I'm here? I got to be Special Advisor to Vince Cable for 4 years, from 2010 to 2014, and for 2.5 years to Theresa May, ending on the same day that she left. So I got to see the proud achievement of landing the net zero legislation, which was, quite something given the state of the government at that time to have got that through. Now, at the time, it's very interesting. I'm going to play a slightly contrarian role here because I'm a long-standing Lib Dem. I remember being at party conferences in 2008-9 where a lot of the same sorts of things would be said as this. You know what? Offshore wind is fantastic, even when it was £150 per megawatt hour. This is much more secure, and everyone was just laughing at them. And if it wasn't for the Lib Dems currently still being in single figures in the polls, they'd be having the greatest sort of smug fest of all right now, just about renewable energy. They seem, apart from maybe Rishi Sunak, to be the fullest of told-you-sos. But it's... everyone's been there, and so like somebody who thinks they discovered the band first and is really annoyed when everyone else comes along and likes the bands and say, oh, well, I saw them when nobody liked them. I want to be the person who says, actually, it's also still going to be really difficult. And it's still going to be difficult in part for reasons that I think are institutionalised in a department called the Treasury. And the Treasury isn't the enemy. The Treasury is an instantiation of a certain unavoidable way of thinking, which, again, we have been reminded of in the last few weeks, that you can like them or not, sack them or not, but there is still some certain facts out there that need to be dealt with. Now, I agree with everything we've already heard from Dan and Alexander. If you need to make the case that it's good for the country to be going ahead with renewable energy, you just need to pull down the graphs from the International Energy Agency, the other IEA, and see the extraordinary progress that's been made in solar power and wind power and so forth. But you should also read the Climate Change Committee's fantastic regular reporting and the net carbon budgets and the zero carbon budgets. I think we're now in 4 and we need 6, 7, 8 to come, showing all the other things that need to happen in agriculture, in industry, in housing and in transport. In fact, we've done the easier bit. That's why that fantastic fact that we keep hearing repeated about how we've managed to cut our energy usage, our carbon emissions, and yet still grow the economy is true, because we've done what would happen in any free market system. You take the easiest, lowest hanging fruit first. The difficult stuff is still to come, and the difficult stuff will require, and here is where I really am being the fly in the ointment, further interference in the market economy. That's the thing that you just can't deny needs to happen. It's not natural to want to build a house with an extra £20,000 of costs because of excellent materials that make it effectively zero carbon. But we need to do that. We've got the worst housing stock in the country. It's not actually natural to replace something as mind-blowingly convenient as an internal combustion engine with electric vehicles. They're getting better and better all the time, but it involves pushing against the market, which involves undoubtedly a real challenge to the orthodoxy of the new government. And I'm going to be fascinated to see whether that orthodoxy can be flexible in the face of what is in fact a really challenging industrial strategy moment. Otherwise, though, I would say this is an opportunity. The really big question for me is whether it is seen as an industrial strategy opportunity, because, again, really good, hard-headed free market thinkers, like we do now have in the government, will say, well, we've had a computer revolution. We didn't insist we had to build all our own computers. We've had a flying revolution. Nobody flew 100 years ago. Now everyone does. We don't insist that all the planes are made here. We let the market sort things out. Why do we not trade? Why do we have to make? There are some really important questions there. And some of them are answered with the point about resilience. Some of them are about installed industrial base. For example, I had the pleasure of bumping into Ian there earlier, who's in the audience. We worked together under Vince Cable to try to make sure that the border effects do not destroy some of our industrial capacity while we're going ahead with our climate change plans. The high carbon price that George Osborne introduced in 2011 might have led to the large-scale closure of industrial plant in this country if we hadn't found mitigating measures to try to hold that at bay. Do we need to think about that more and more? These are really difficult decisions, and they're quite difficult decisions in PR terms as well, because it often means helping dirty industries while you move on to the green industries. So I want to agree with the premise of this question. It's definitely the case that you can become more prosperous, you can help the economy, you can become more resilient by moving towards renewable net zero technologies. But my goodness, are there a feast of economic challenges to take on along the way.
Thank you, Giles. Say.
Yeah, so as other panellists have said, this is a really timely discussion in relation to the context we find ourselves in at the moment in the midst of a cost of living crisis. Just to share some reflections from our experience in our research and also what we're seeing with people coming through our doors at Citizens Advice. I think often people think people come to Citizens Advice who perhaps are the most vulnerable, and yes, that's true, but actually what we've been seeing over this year is increasingly we're having more people come to us for the first time. Those people who could, I guess, be classed as just about managing. So, for example, in August, 71% of the people that came to us for help were first-time users of our services. Up till the 21st of September this year, 55,000 people contacted us around energy costs, real concern about energy debt in particular. That's a 94% increase on last year. So the scale of the problem is, as I'm sure you're all very aware, massive. So when it comes to net zero, what's our viewpoint on this? So decarbonising does bring down bills. We know that energy efficiency measures not only reduce carbon emissions, but we've just recently done some research called Insulation Nation that showed that on an average household could save almost £350 a year on their energy bills if they were upgraded to an EPC C, and the most least efficient homes would save nearly £1,000 a year. That's massive. That's a total saving across the economy of 8.1 million annually. So energy efficiency should be key to all this, but also I think to touch on what one of the panellists have talked about is we shouldn't be putting in new build homes that will require us to go back and expensively retrofit them. We have an opportunity now to put in the most efficient homes possible so that people can feel warm and comfortable in their homes. Also, smart products and services can also bring down energy costs, but we do need to make sure that they're accessible to everybody, regardless of their circumstances. So research has shown that smart products and services can save significant amount on people's bills, but from polling that we've done, we see going around 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds would be interested in how they can use smart products and services, but that drops significantly when you're talking about older age groups over 65. Not quite so sure about things like time of use tariffs, not that they're available at the moment. So we think it's really, really important to have these things accessible to everyone, and in the Energy Security Bill, I think there are plans to better regulate some of these products and services, and we definitely think that's a way forward. And finally, moving to net zero, as I'm sure you'll have heard time and time again over this conference, it helps shore up our energy security and move us away from that reliance on volatile gas markets. But even if we did, because there's been talk around fracking, hasn't there, if we did produce more gas at home, it will still follow international prices, and we can't risk another surge. So renewable energy is cheap, and we need to think about decoupling electricity pricing from gas pricing so that consumers can feel those benefits on their household bills. So I'll leave it there and we'll get to the good stuff.
Oh no, don't worry. Thank you very much. So actually, I'm inspired by something you were saying towards the start. Then, obviously, the big energy story at the moment, as important as net zero is the gas, not energy. I'll correct myself there. Crisis we're facing this winter, and people struggling with their bills. And of course, the government has done a huge intervention on this to try and hold down people's bills. But I would just like to ask the panel in turn, what more do they think can or should be done to help support people through the winter, and whether those choices are compatible with our net zero ambitions? Is action that we have to take in the short term, and maybe even in the medium term, to shore up our energy security and to bring bills down, can that be done in tandem with the pursuit of net zero? Alex?
Yeah, of course it can be. I mean, fundamentally, the government has to and did step in to help people, and if there's further measures going down the line needed, they'll need to make further measures. But that doesn't mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And just mentioned a quite interesting point about fracking. We all know fracking is a bit of a red herring, and I'll be very surprised if fracking ever happens in this country, even despite the announcements. So you can sort of do virtual signal in one way with fracking, but not actually make it happen, and doesn't actually affect our net zero. But one thing I want to pick up also by using is the time of use tariffs, which I just mentioned. And time of use tariffs is a technology, basically, we need to develop, a model to develop, which is now going to be killed while the government's subsidising people's energy. So the trade-off really is allowing the market to come up with innovative ways of pricing, innovative ways of technology, but because of time of use tariffs, the government subsidy in the cap, means actually we're not going to have that. I was on a panel with Scottish Power yesterday, and they basically said the subsidy is going to kill this sort of market innovation. So the trade-off, though, is the government stepping in and helping people, as it should, and also companies naturally adapting and going towards low carbon. So we have to be very careful with what we do and how long we give the support. But fundamentally, we just need to make sure everyone can keep the lights on and pay their bills.
Right, Dan?
Well, I think there's been a lot of column inches written at the moment about certain generators. Let's say those generators who aren't relying on gas, making excess profits over the course of this winter. And I think that's something that the government have been looking to address. I want to be really clear. Most renewable generators have a strategy with those who have a big portfolio sell their electricity forward in the market a year ahead. So most consumers, or all consumers rather, are benefiting from those low costs and those hedges that were made a year ago. So the problem, actually, arguably, is not necessarily this winter, it's what might happen next winter if prices remain high. And what we've proposed in the industry is to transition those generators away from, let's say, merchant exposure towards being in the fixed price contracts, the contracts for difference, which is the principal policy of this government right now. There are, and here, I know we don't look to Europe quite often, as often as we used to, but the European Union made a major intervention in the market last week, which has capped the price. And that has caused enormous disruption right the way across the European electricity market, where my colleagues in Wind Europe have been given clear marching instructions to go to the Commission and say, our members are going to invest in America, in other countries which have got clear, stable regimes. So my message is, think about the significant problems that we're going to face, which will probably be further down the track rather than the short term, just because of the way the market is designed, and make intelligent interventions in collaboration with the industry, because unfortunately, because the way we've designed it, the energy market is rather complicated, and sending very, very short-termist signals is likely to have unintended consequences that reverberate in other areas. I would also like to just point on the time of use thing, because we are seeing disruptive business models come out in the industry, and Octopus and one of our members, Res, have been doing schemes where they provide discounts to local communities which are close to the wind farms that they build, When the wind turbine is turning, they get the benefit of lower electricity prices, so they're encouraged to switch on their washing machine at that point in time. Well, it's early days for this, but these are the types of disruptive business models that we can see coming further forward.
Very good. Charles?
Thank you, William. I'm going to distinguish myself by not having a view on time of use tariffs. But I do think it's a really good question and hits at a potential dilemma in that an intervention to help people with their energy bills, if it's sufficiently badly designed, can indeed damage the net zero agenda. In particular, the really obvious point that market signals are really important. I love being the guy preaching free market stuff here. But market signals are really important. I doubt anyone here has not been looking at their meter recently and working out what's draining the electricity. I had an absolute epiphany in March when I realised what my immersion heater was doing to my house. And we want everybody, there's 30 million energy users in this country. We want everybody thinking about it. And the higher the price, the more people think about it. At the same time, we don't want people to be driven to the wall. So the ideal sort of energy intervention helps people on very, very low incomes, helps everybody a certain degree, does keep people exposed to the high price. I think this government hasn't got it wrong. £2,500 household bills. When we brought in the energy price cap in 2018, we were having waking nightmares about a moment where it might go up to £1,600 and the government gets blamed. So £2,500 for a typical household is a really high kind of bill that makes you think about it. But nobody says to people, stop. That effect carries on as the price goes up. So ideally, if there had been time, you would have wanted something that capped it up to a certain point and kept the energy price exposure really high. It's really difficult for a government in this situation to come out with that sort of thing quickly, so they have my sympathy. The other point I would make is about the sort of upstream interference that was being referred to earlier. I agree, we had an argument in the office, my other office, Flint Global, which is a consultancy, about what should energy companies be asking if there are what economists call massive economic rents from having fixed energy costs and massive variable prices that they're exploiting. And in the end, I think the companies came around to the view that I had in that argument, which is a windfall tax is actually better than the government coming in and trying to be too clever and impose and breaking contracts. A windfall tax, I mean, all of these are dreadful. We're talking about sort of varieties of second best option. But if the government does think that social justice requires that the beneficiaries of a price spike need to pay the people who are losing out, a windfall tax kind of goes after the thing that they get, which is the profit, whereas governments trying to interfere upstream in wholesale energy markets has all the disasters that every free marketeer should ever be having nightmares about. You could get so much wrong trying to design rewritten contracts for people who've taken 15, 20 years to plan and invest in providing electricity. So, yeah, I do think they need to be really careful that in trying to make things better, they make things much, much worse and dissuade the sort of investment that Renewable UK oversee.
Thank you, Giles. Zoe?
Yeah, so I think, we did have a bit of a missed opportunity this summer when we could have really started kick-starting a programme of energy efficiency. What we're seeing, as I alluded to earlier, is that we've got an able-to-pay market that is rapidly shrinking. So even when it makes economic sense to do these things, they literally have nothing left in their purses at the end of the month to do it. So I think, we really need to focus on what can we do for next winter, how can we make sure that people's homes are as warm and as comfortable as possible and more affordable to run. I think it's also important during this time to think about what does a future price support look like beyond the price cap, what is something that's much more sustainable. So we've seen lots of talk around social tariffs, and Citizens Advice is doing a price support review with various experts across the industry to try and unpack what a price support might look like going forward, so that we can make sure that the most vulnerable in our society can still afford to both heat and eat.
Very good. Right then, I think we might move on to audience questions now, and we can always come back to one of my sort of eclectic list of potential ones later on. But the way this is going to work is that my two glamorous assistants over there are carrying the microphones, and we'll have two questions at a time. Monologue rules apply. So who wants to ask one first? So can we have the lady, one for the lady at the front here, and the gentleman at the back there?
Thanks. Hi, Leah Davis from MPC. We're a social policy think tank. The panel have rightly said that there's quite a lot of measures that are quite cheap, lots of people could install, but there's a lot of homes that are going to need quite expensive measures. and people on low incomes often live in those homes, thousands, tens of thousands of pounds sometimes. Who do the panel think should pay for this?
Thank you.
Well, apologies, mine doesn't dovetail at all. It was, what would you want to see from the Chris Skidmore review of net zero?
Thank you. So I think we'll go through the panel in turn, as to where. Alex?
On the Chris Skidmore review, what I want to see a rather commitment to net zero and the benefits, the financial benefits of net zero as well. I'm really seeing that message to try and get any of the last remaining sceptics across the line about opportunity for jobs and opportunities for growth. That's what I want to see, and I want that reconfirmed. The previous government under Boris Johnson was very in favour of net zero. We need to make sure we have to keep fighting that argument as well. And I think Chris is a great guy to do that. He's the right person to do that. So I'm confident he'll come up with, frankly, the correct answers. On your question...
Just on that point, Alex, how do you think the argument has changed since Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Because I think that's really highlighted the importance of net zero for security reasons. And do you think that's going to reflect messaging about net zero in the future?
Hugely. We need to have, I think the message is, rightly, we need to have our homegrown energy sources from renewables. We need to wean ourselves off hydrocarbons. I mean, it's not a new argument the sector hasn't been making for the last 20, 30 years, but I think it's brought it home to the general population that we can't rely on gas and stuff. People actually understand this now, so important, I think more so. On what measures can be taken, sort of homes which are not, people with low incomes who can't afford to it, I go back to my first point. There's a lot of measures people can take to save money without having to insulate your loft, without having to do it, turn the wall down. Frankly, where is the government national information campaign like it was a COVID telling me how to do the cheap things like turn down my boiler? I didn't know about boiler flow temperatures until literally a few weeks ago. Why are people not told this in May? Why is there not a letter going through people's door like there was during COVID, telling people this information and actually a proper sort of messaging campaign? If you see what the French energy minister is doing, and I hate to sort of celebrate the French government in any of its forms, they're doing an amazing job. Actually, constantly, the French energy minister is constantly out there talking about measures, easy steps that people can be doing. Even, some of it's virtual signalling, like turning off the lights to the Eiffel Tower, but it sends a message clearly that you can make those easy changes that will save money immediately. Because obviously, the cheapest form of energy is energy you don't use. And there is so much waste energy in people's homes where they don't need to do it. Obviously, people who are more vulnerable, who need energy for things like dialysis, older people, should be encouraging it. With all the messaging, be very careful. Because some people in this country should be using more energy. And often we see with the messaging, those people who are most vulnerable often take the messages more to heart, especially older people, and therefore they'll be scared into their energy costs, and therefore turn it off, which is actually bad for health. So we need to be careful, and the media also need to be careful about sort of almost scare stories about costs, because the last thing we want to do, especially vulnerable people who think, oh my God, I cannot afford to heat my home, when frankly they can and they should, and they turn that heating off. So it's a very nuanced thing we have to do. But there are those steps we can take straight away, which will actually cost very little money, which will improve everyone's well-being.
Well, Con Home always tries to be nuanced in our messaging on issues like this. Dan?
So first of all, on the Chris Skidmore review, I would quite like it to answer the questions that Giles put on the table about why should we make stuff here? Why should we do stuff? I mean, I think there's just a really important story about this being a global transition that is being made. This is therefore a giant global market opportunity for our innovation, our technology, and we don't have to do everything. Let's be clear. There's lots of technologies where other countries have taken the early leadership, but we've got great capability in things like digital, in robotics, in autonomous vehicles, high-value manufacturing. In these spaces, there's a lot we can bring to the renewables, and I think we should really try and see some of those stories come through Chris's review. So it isn't just about net zero per se, but it's how you really turn it into a long-term opportunity. On the question on homes, I kind of see it as, who should pay? This is a really difficult area, and I think, my own experience is I live in a very old, 200-year-old house in the centre of Liverpool, which is in a conservation area, so I'm not allowed to do anything today. I can't put solar panels on the roof. I can't put in new windows unless they're super expensive. It's really difficult to insulate it. There's a whole bracket of people who are in that space. The social housing, I kind of see it in 3 layers. The social housing piece is kind of a government. Government can do a lot to regulate and to support and drive. there's a top level where people should probably pay themselves, and there's a bit in the middle where you need a combination of market interventions, incentives, where government probably needs to send a bit of a strategic guiding hand, but there's also space for huge amounts of innovation in that area as well. So I think it's really tricky.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. I'd like to start with Leah's question. I think it's a really interesting one. I believe the cost to getting our housing stock to a state good enough for net zero comes to 300 to 500 billion pounds in total, and 100 billion here, 100 billion there. Soon you're really talking real money. I don't think, from my rough maths, that you can expect the poor to pay that. And I do remember there have been lots of attempts. The Green Deal under the coalition, for example, was one from which we all probably still have scars on our back. You can't expect people, even if you confront them with the maths that says it's got a great internal rate of return, that this will work. If I remember rightly, loft insulation can pay itself back in a year or two, and that's a place where, if people can't do it, they should be helped in every possible way. That's a fantastic investment. Cavity wall insulation, 5 or 6 years. That was at the energy prices back then, so it might be even better now. So people who haven't got cavity wall should be getting cavity wall. Solid wall, I remember being told, it's got a kind of rate of return of about 3 or 4%, and you will probably lose your spouse in the process because it makes your house look really, really horrible. So good luck going around. I sometimes wonder how the Lib Dems manage to get 6 or 7% in the polls when their positive idea was, we're going to knock on doors and say, do you want to uglify your house for no return whatsoever? Here's a big loan to do it. And so we do need to have better ideas. This is what I think the state was created for, having given all my free market preaching earlier. It's an asset for the country. It's lowering the country's emissions. Obviously, there's a private gain, but this is the sort of thing that it makes sense that the country invests at a really cheap cost of capital compared to normal people. And I think it's probably only the country that can kind of make that kind of investment. So we can try to come up with really clever financial innovations that somehow bring forward the savings from insulation and securitize it, and you can just imagine the horror stories written 10 years later. Or we can just simply borrow to invest and get really good at doing it, because it's unavoidable that we have to do it for net zero, and it does benefit the people who need to be benefited that way. I don't think I have very much more to add on. I think you made a really good point there, Dan. I mean, it's we don't think hard enough about where the industrial strategy lines need to be drawn. Possibly, I think we could be doing more in this country, but we need to be making the case each time in full awareness that we are in a global market. And if you embark on a course where you try to do something and the country just over the water is 10% better, you are opening up a money hole, and at some point the Treasury will come after you. So you do need to do the maths first. And I hope Chris does it.
Very good. So.
Yeah, I'm just going to focus on Leah's question. And, a couple of weeks ago we released our report, Insulation Nation, and we were really clear that there should be a Great British Energy Efficiency Scheme, and that, just to pick up on Giles's point, that that really is an investment in our housing stock, and it should be as simple as possible. So that's what we know, that the problems previously with things like the Green Homes Grant, that was too complicated for people to engage with. So we recommended a system of grants that could be on a sliding scale depending on people's income, that they could access what they need. And some of our number crunching around that demonstrated that for 37 billion, which is the same amount as the emergency support package, you could insulate and make more warm and comfortable 9 million homes. I mean, that could be significantly more depending on how much each home needs doing to it. So we're definitely of the opinion that, as I said before, the able to pay market is shrinking. Even sometimes when people can afford to pay for it, they don't want to, but we should be encouraging those people to put their money into this, because I think there's a good investment, but there's just an increasing number of people that just don't have any money spare, and to, like I said, could be saving up to £1,000 on their energy bills, which is significant.
On the point that Alex raised, what would you say about messaging? What can the government be doing to tell people ahead of this winter how they can reduce their bills and keep their homes warm?
So I think Alex has heard me say this before, we do need to be really, really careful about what we're telling people to do in their homes, because the majority of people will be using less this winter. They absolutely guarantee it, that there will be many people going cold. I think, what we should really focus on is where we can, getting people to implement measures that they can. but then where they need help and support to be seeking that so that they aren't underheating their homes, because all you will see is then much more strain on other public services such as the NHS, and I'm genuinely scared for the numbers of people that we might see with respiratory illnesses. I mean, we already are a bit worried about what flu's going to bring this winter, and combine that with cold homes, it's the perfect storm.
Yes, just when we thought things might be coming down slightly on the respiratory illness front. Another couple of questions. The gentleman on the end of the first row here, and the gentleman on the end of that row over there.
Hi, John Johnson from Politics Home. Question mainly for Alex. You spoke about fracking and the possibility that it's not going to happen. That seems to be shared quite widely by MPs that I've spoken to over the last few days. But all it's done is wind up your colleagues, created a headache for activists on the doorstep, and there doesn't seem to be really any chance of this going through. I mean, are you frustrated that the government have kind of created this row when there's very little chance of there being any upside?
And the gentleman over there.
Chris Hewitt from Solar Energy UK. My question is whether the Treasury should be changing its mind on net zero, because the dynamics that Giles described at the start, where renewables are very expensive, a lot of subsidies, the Treasury were instinctively, institutionally, pretty much anti-renewables at that point because it was costing the taxpayer and consumer a lot of money. Understand why? It's now flipped. So the energy bill support mechanism is, most of that is buying expensive gas. So we now have a very expensive fossil fuel subsidy coming off the public balance sheet. So should the Treasury now be really pushing for private capital to go into offshore wind, to go into solar, to go into energy efficiency, to sort their borrowing problems out, frankly?
Thank you. Alex, do you want to sort of take the specific question and then...
Well, on the last question, yes.
The last
question, yes, the Treasury should be doing that. I think that's a great idea. On the fracking question, I'll be honest, I've got 2 fracking sites in my constituency. So both right next to villages. I think it's... I don't think that we should be reopening this can of worms of fracking, because I don't see any particular benefit. Because if fracking even does come online, it's not going to get the gas we need. It's going to play into international markets. It's not going to bring down prices. On the other hand, the government has made it clear that it's all about community consent. And if the local community wanted to have, and will get a financial benefit, go back to the sort of cost of living crisis, and if local residents feel that they should be able to use one of their local assets to lower their bills, should we be telling them not to? In my seat, I don't think it will work at all, because there's clearly no community support. But there might be some places where there are community support. So there is that sort of freedom. I think there is general acceptance, though, that we are conservative after all, we want to have freedom, and if the communities don't want it, they shouldn't have it.
What about, though, on that point, other forms of low-carbon energy? Should the government be pushing through, say, wind farms or solar panel stations and the like, where there isn't public support for it, in the pursuit of net zero?
Yeah, well, I mean, once again, just looking at my own seat, we have, in the same village I live in, where there's a fracking site, there's also wind turbines as well, which were highly controversial when they were put in. But now no one really sort of blinks an eyelid about them, and actually they pay into a community fund and pays for sort of heating of the local village hall and stuff like that. So actually, after that battle had been fought and was lost at the time by residents, actually people see the benefits. But then I think you talk about solar farms. Now that's something the government has an ambitious project for rolling out solar. Solar farms are highly controversial. I've got one planned in my constituency. So we need to make sure we bring communities along with us. And I very much believe that when we have these sort of large-scale developments, you have to show material benefit for residents as well. I think it goes back to what I was saying about talking about carbon and net zero. I don't think it's right we should be just playing into the sort of ephemeral, you'll do your bit for the planet, because that doesn't appeal to anyone, really, doing your bit for the planet, especially when you're looking at places like India and China. We've got to say, actually, if your community wants solar panels, your local community will see a benefit, a material benefit to your way of life, to your energy bills. And that's the only way you can do it. But I'm always very reticent against the government forcing people to do anything. And that is why some of the planning laws, especially as we just mentioned about putting new windows in and solar panels, that is something the government can do to make it easier for people who want to and frankly have the money to actually improve net zero. We need to relax those planning laws, but not relax those wider planning issues that will have a detrimental effect on the wider community.
As ever in British politics, it all comes down to planning regulations. Dan?
I think on the fracking point, look, I mean, you can imagine what my opinion is, so I probably don't need to socialise it too much. But what I would say is that if the whole idea is predicated on the point of consumer and community engagement, and that is put front and centre of the politics, then I'm very confident that with the changes that were made in the mini budget regarding onshore wind, that if you ask communities to choose between fracking and onshore wind and solar, they will choose onshore wind and solar over fracking every time. And we've done polling after polling that has proven that. And actually, and I don't know how well this is known in the Conservative Party, but the support for renewables is actually greater among people who voted Conservative in the last election than there is for those who voted for any other party. So, there is a really strong level of support for building new renewable energy assets, and I think it's very unlikely that they're going to choose fracking if they were faced with that arguably false choice. But, it's kind of proven itself time and again.
Charles?
I'll comment on the Treasury one. I mean, despite my sort of affectionate joke earlier, I'm extremely proud of what the Lib Dems managed to do under the coalition in getting the wind thing really going, and the energy market reform that was stewarded there with support from Conservative colleagues. And one of the things they had to do was resist the Treasury's thinking at the time. And here, my backhanded compliment to the Treasury is they're extremely good at forcing you to reflect market realities as they are. So at the time, wind was £140 per megawatt hour, solar was expensive, even onshore wasn't as cheap as gas. And they said, look at that, that's going to be your subsidy. There's something called the levy control framework. It's not allowed to burst through, £11 billion? And they say, stick to that budget. And that budget was even tightened in 2015. What the Treasury's bad at is structural reform, realising that the market can be different. I mean, let's face it, though, nobody saw that decline in wind prices. If anyone had put it into a think tank pamphlet, don't worry, wind will be 37 3/4 or something within a few years. They'd have just been accused of being a fantasist. So, but the Treasury does need to be asked to think more imaginatively. The great sort of joke that's told, it might not be an apocryphal story at all, is that if the Treasury had its way, the M25 would have had 2 lanes, because that's all they had at the time. The dynamic growth of now, maybe this isn't the right environmentally conscious room to say that's a good thing, but understanding how you can actually transform the country, and the sort of thinking that was the imaginative thinking that was in the Levelling Up white paper, the Treasury doesn't really go with that. And what you need to overcome this, it's not about sort of going after particular officials. You need a really powerful, commanding, and united economic thinker at the top that says, I'm in charge. What you need to have is actually something I've never seen in my lifetime, which is a Treasury and Bays that think in roughly the same and correct way. So, a Heseltinian and an Osborne sort of style thinking that can actually think together says, yes, you can change the world, but you need to be proactive, intervening in a way that understands market signals and understands structural reform. So, yeah, there's a job of work to be done there, but they are excellent people, and if any bunch of people have the IQs to do it, I think it's them.
The Heseltine-Osborne leadership bid began here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes,
one of the things that I think came out through what Charles was saying there, and previous speakers have touched upon, is the idea that the Treasury and the discussion around it need to focus on seeing these things as investment, rather than waiting until we have crises like this winter and then having to borrow record amounts in order to help people through those crises. Would you like to see more of a focus in government on making these bigger decisions early on to invest in things like that insulation package you were talking about earlier, rather than waiting for the crisis to get as it is and then having to, at great expense, intervene to tackle it?
Yeah, I mean, that feels like a no-brainer to me. I think, we've known for decades that energy efficiency makes sense, and never has it made more sense than it does today. So I think there needs to be a shift in mindset about how you view energy efficiency. I think there's always been this focus on big kit, on power stations, and that's always looked much more attractive from that sort of traditional economic viewpoint. But we've got 29 million homes. That is a significant amount of infrastructure, and maybe there needs to be a mind shift towards that as infrastructure, rather than, it's just, a collection of people need to do things to their homes in the same way that they would choose to have a new kitchen. it's not commensurate at all. I think we need a much more bolder viewpoint on this stuff.
Very good. Another couple of questions, please. So one from the gentleman on the end over here, and one from the gentleman in the middle row there. Sorry, the gentleman there. Middle. Got there in the end. Sir.
Thank you. Richard Weymouth, I'm the Deputy Leader in Northumberland, home of the Renewable Energy Catapult, and hopefully a gigafactory and all sorts of other things that are going on in the wider green agenda. My question is, specifically, we've talked about Treasury being able to put in place mechanisms around CFD and so on and so forth alongside BEIS, but there's a lot of work still to do to actually develop the technology that achieves that level that's been bid in by offshore wind. The turbines have to get bigger, it has to be proved, there has to be a lot of R&D, a lot of opportunity to land supply chain. Do you think that the Treasury and BEIS are on track to achieve that with the support packages and measures in place and the significant financial requirements to do that?
Thank you, sir.
Hello, Arjen Geevik, Energy Intensive Users Group, former civil servant working with Charles. Just want to follow up a few questions on energy efficiency. Sorry, Dan. The focus has mainly been on energy efficiency in households, but my question is business. How would the panel see what government and the market could do to improve energy efficiency in businesses?
Thank you. Alex?
Well, that's a big question. A lot of thank you on the energy for business. I think a lot does actually go back to finance as well. I think going back to the earlier question about who's going to pay for more vulnerable households, is one thing government supporting vulnerable households. It's another thing government supporting business. But we also got to realise government has to, and it stepped in recently to support business in the mini budget, small businesses, because we need business to survive. When you're a small business, a cafe, a pub, bakery, you cannot afford to pay the gas prices. And there are going to be some businesses that naturally use a lot more energy. I think what we need to use this as an opportunity, especially for energy-intensive industries, is really to transform how we do energy. And things like hydrogen especially. We need to actually use this as an opportunity for the government frankly to step in and say, we are going to give you support to get you through the winter, but actually you need to start looking at the new technologies, such as hydrogen, to actually move you move you away from hydrocarbons, so that we can actually go towards the net zero. On the energy efficiency, we also need to make sure there's enough schemes internally in the businesses, so they are financially sensitive to insulate their buildings as well. Generally, we find though that a lot of modern buildings, industry buildings, are actually relatively okay comparatively, but those ones that are not, we need to have some schemes to make sure we're all working together for energy efficiency, and the government does need that support.
Thank you. Dan?
Well, first of all, on the technology question, I think the short answer is yes, there's enough R&D going on in private industry to deliver what's needed for the next phase of renewables rollout. But no, there's not enough R&D going on. There's particularly late stage R&D in the UK to really get the benefit of the industrial benefit that we like to see. So I give you a great example, and it's really straightforward. When you test an offshore wind turbine, and it's a brand new one, typically you do it onshore. That might go against everyone's thinking. Typically you do it onshore because if something's brand new, the last thing you want to do is send someone on a boat every time you want to inspect it. We don't have anywhere in the UK where we can do an onshore test. We don't. And so all of that late stage development of wind turbines happens in the Netherlands and Denmark and places where they have these facilities. So I would love to see somewhere where we could be putting that type of thing, and that attracts then long-term jobs and innovation. So there's more we can do to get the real supply chain built up. On the point on energy efficiency, I think in industry it is really challenging. Definitely an important story around the role of hydrogen and alternative fuels, and particularly where in industry where heat is an important part of the equation. Energy efficiency has probably avoided, and I was trying to dig out the report a minute ago, but it was there's probably 20 power stations that we've not had to build in the UK since 1990 just through energy efficiency that we've done. The last time that study was done was about 5 years ago, and it was definitely 14 power stations that we'd worked out. So there's huge natural benefit that comes, and we've grown our economy a lot without increasing our electricity demand. That's really an important point to remember. But there's so much more that can be done in industry, and there's also a big role for the demand side. So the demand side response and letting industry play its role within a variable market.
Thank you, Giles.
This is a really difficult question. If the question is enough R&D going in there? It's not the sort of question you should want a policy wonk to be able to answer. Because, I mean, what would I claim to know that would say I'm aware that... I mean, the big problem with R&D, obviously, is if all the returns were captured privately, then you could just leave it to the market. The problem is that we all benefit from R&D. It spills over. One figure has it at 98%. So you need, therefore, there's a really strong case for the state to do more. Even more so when we're talking about R&D in something which is the ultimate externality, the carbon problem. So you would think, almost a priori, there's no way we can be doing enough, particularly if you believe some of the more apocalyptic stories of the actual costs. What I'm really interested to know, the catapults were another thing we're really pleased to have introduced under the coalition government. I'm surprised they haven't grown or become bigger or been emulated. I'm wondering whether there's something that could have been done there. They're meant to have been that fantastic area for that last stage deployment. And everyone's generally very pleased with them and with having stuck with them. I'm never quite sure whether there's just a natural limit to these things, that they can only be of this sort of £30 million size, or whether it's a classic example of us being prepared to go a certain distance but not absolutely blow the doors off when it comes to that sort of intervention. But if we take net zero really seriously, R&D is the ultimate answer. You know, I've read something amazing today about some place being the first place for a fusion plant. In all seriousness, if fusion worked, it's worth going for it. I mean, wow, what that could do. On the second subject, to become even more treasury-minded, I mean, one of the questions I've always had, we all know the case for helping households with energy efficiency. They're financially constrained, they're not necessarily economically rational actors. They don't know how to internalise the benefit of energy efficiency and say, this makes sense as an investment. Businesses are meant to be different, which is why it was always difficult, in my view, to make a case for energy efficiency interventions on behalf of business, which involved, in a sense, a kind of nannying, going around and saying, do you know if you close off this pipe and lag this and run this better, you could be saving money? Well, don't they have a finance director who's meant to be teaching them how? So where's what I never understood, I never got past this argument, and I should have, is where the market failure is that the finance director, who has a good intrinsic motivation to be saving money, isn't. And what do we know? I mean, I'd love to hear your answer.
We did all the work after you left, Charles.
I knew you were waiting for me to go. Okay.
Right. Thank you. Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, on the energy efficiency point and businesses generally, I mean, there's just such a wide plethora, isn't there, of micro businesses. They're essentially the same as households, so they will need a different level of advice and support through to SMEs and then larger businesses. I think the answer is around intelligent financing and having different financing mechanisms available as well as other incentives. But I think also REMA is going to play a big part in around some of the low carbon access to grid. So in the previous talk that I was at, a lady was there representing warehouses, and a big frustration for them is they want to get lots of solar panels onto these warehouses, but then they struggle to get access to grid. So I think that's where REMA is going to play such a large part to help people generate their own energy, sell that back to the grid, and then make all this much more attractive to them as businesses.
Very good. Another couple of questions? Probably our last round. We have the gentleman at the front here and the gentleman over there.
Hi, Dominic Weeks from Zero Avia. We're making hydrogen electric engines for aircraft, so we obviously see a big future in hydrogen and lowering costs in that field. I'm just curious, hydrogen's come up a couple of times. Where do you see it saving money for people long term?
Thank you. And the gentleman over there?
Anthony Painter from the Chartered Management Institute. The story so far has been very much one of technology, markets, industrial policy, R&D. At the same time, there's been a lot of allusions to the scale of the resources going to be required and the scale of the behaviour change that's going to be needed. What role, if any, is there for taxation? What is that role, and how do we have that conversation in a politically rational way?
Thank you. Alex?
I'll tackle the first one or the second one rather, about taxation. We need to have a rethink about how we do taxation. I mean, let's look at EVs alone. We want people to drive EVs, that's good. We're not going to raise nearly as much money from fuel duty, but the government will still need to find a way to get the money coming in, so need to look at road pricing. And the same with energy efficiency. Fear not, though, you'll be paying as much tax now as you would be in the future. The government will find a way. I mean, be on no illusion that the government always finds a way to get its money from the populace. It'll just have to look at more innovative ways of doing that. What they are, we will have to see. On hydrogen, I'm vice chair of the Hydrogen All Party Group. I think hydrogen is a central part of our energy mix in the future, especially when it comes to heavy duty and long distance travel, such as aviation, trucks, but also I think there's a potential for home heating as well. It's not going to be the silver bullet and it's not going to be suitable for everywhere, but if we can even just mix 20% in our pipes, that lowers emissions by 6%, and it will be suitable for some places. Not everyone's going to have a heat source pump in the next 20 years. We replace about 2 million boilers a year at the current rate. We're not going to put about 30 million in the country. If we want to get net zero, we just don't have the resource to change everyone's boilers in time. It's as simple as that. So if we want to get to net zero, we need to use hydrogen as part of that mix. But your question particularly was about the costs of hydrogen and energy saving. I think one of those is actually, because we are still a world leader in the hydrogen technology and development of hydrogen engines and hydrogen itself, we can then go back to my point and actually save costs by exporting their expertise and their technology abroad and making it clear that we are still the forebearers, and we're being caught up quickly by likes of Germany and stuff, but we can then sell it abroad, sell their expertise, and that is how we have to view, frankly, all of net zero technology. We have to say, it may not put, save you 3 pence off your bill here, but actually, if you're going to have a better job, if we can actually have more business coming in, we can save money that way.
Thank you. Dan?
I agree with a lot with what Alex has just said. I think the hydrogen story in particular is going to be helping people reduce costs the more we use renewable electricity to create it. And I genuinely think that the cost of lower, that trajectory of low-cost renewable energy is going to help you deliver lower-cost hydrogen in the long run. I think I'd probably go back to the previous question about R&D in the UK and to link it back to this, which is I think we can do an even better job if and this is definitely one area where we're probably not doing enough R&D in the UK, and where we ought to have another catapult, or we should give one of the catapults the job and the funding and the money to really go after this technology in a big way. So I think there's definitely more we can do there. On taxation, I'm probably less qualified to answer, other than to say that market signals, wherever they are and whoever they are to, tend to work. And if we do use the tax system, then we can inevitably, nudge behaviour. And I think particularly on the domestic end, where we've been talking a lot about energy efficiency, I think encouraging and providing people with the mechanism to make investments in their own home, in a way which isn't punitive on the tax side or gives them benefits, then absolutely it's part of the equation.
Thank you. Giles?
First on hydrogen, an absolute menace in public policy you should want to avoid at all times is for a SPAD-like person to have a strong view on a technology. It's absolutely a very quick route to ruin. So I'm not going to say I know anything about hydrogen, but I bet the name Michael Liebriggs fills you with horror and loathing on some of this stuff. I mean, I've taken a lot from him because he's apparently a real expert, and he says it can't really be the answer in transport. I've heard it might be somewhat in home heating, and it could have phenomenal uses in industrial energy use. But like my previous answer, we have changes that happen all the time, and what works at one price point can then suddenly work at a different price point, and price points move really, really hard. So it's definitely going to be a really key part of the answer. A gas that burns at a higher temperature, I understand, than methane, and then just lets off water, it sounds like a great thing. And so we should be trying to get the most out of that. I don't know whether we have a technological lead. I do know we're going to suffer a problem with, we have an industrial superpower on our doorstep in Germany and a whole lot of money going in there too. So we do need to be careful that we don't find ourselves chasing their subsidies along the road. They have a hell of a chemicals industry there. But yeah, we should be trying to see some advantage there. And a lot of it has to be domiciled in the UK, because I can't see there being massive hydrogen ships floating or new hydrogen gas pipelines, as the sound stops above. So on the subject of taxation, I'm more positive about tax than most people. I think tax, we've understood for a long time that there can be this thing called Pigovian taxation, which takes into account externalities. And I think, so Anthony, I think you're hinting at something that might be quite valuable here. We have to be quite careful with it, though. If you start taxing something because it's a bad thing, your neighbours don't tax it as well, you just end up with carbon leakage. And that kind of coordination just takes a slightly grown up and strategic view to international relations in that sort of area. So yes, there is an answer to taxation. Ideally, you should have land taxes and environmental bad taxes, and then cut the sort of taxes on work and investment. And if you can pull that off, you have a really great tax system.
Very good. Do you have any thoughts on that, Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, on hydrogen specifically, I think the case still has to be made for the extent to which hydrogen is needed for domestic heating and hot water. It certainly won't be appropriate everywhere, but I think most people know there needs to be a mix of technologies anyway when it comes to home heating. I think the main thing is we need some clarity around where hydrogen might be best placed to deliver for industry, but also maybe is there any residual there for domestic properties close by. I think there's still a huge amount of uncertainty around the cost of hydrogen for very good reasons, but I think we need to get much more of a handle on that in order to be able to understand, will it save us money?
Very good. And with about 7 minutes left before the end of the event, I'd like to ask each of our panel members briefly if the Prime Minister could say one thing on net zero tomorrow in her speech, what would you hope that it was? Alex?
We're going to be the global superpower in net zero. We can get the jobs, we'll be the world leader in it, and all technology involved.
Sounds very good. Dan?
Yeah, I'd like to reconfirm that the commitment of the previous government is as strong and as ambitious with this government, and that we're going to make as much of it in Britain as we can with the great technical capabilities that we have here.
Charles?
Not wishing to cause too much mischief here, but I'd like her to say, yeah, net zero is a fantastic opportunity. James Dellingpole has always been wrong, and I'm going to be listening to Chris Skidmore.
Very nice. And Zoe?
Yeah, and similarly to Dan, that you would reaffirm their commitment to net zero and announce that energy efficiency is going to be the cornerstone of a net zero strategy.
Excellent. And on that bombshell, I would ask if everybody could give a big hand to our panellists today. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.